I fought for God. Who do you fight for, Exile?
Hello and welcome to another Path of Exile build guide. If you like the idea of running around faster than a speeding bullet while monsters evaporate in a hailstorm of fiery arrows, then I've got the perfect build for you. Plop down those totems and watch them tear everything to shreds with Lunasic's one-shot kill Elemental Hit Totems. Here's the high-level breakdown of the build's capabilities. One of the fastest and most efficient clearing builds out there, with huge speed and DPS, you will finish story mode in no time and afterwards blitz through maps all the way to Uber Elder. With a few key pieces of gear, you'll be able to kill toughest bosses in the game in record time. And with a safer totem playstyle, you can do that without dying even once. However, since it's still an evasion build, I would generally not recommend it for hardcore play unless you're really experienced. Overall, it strikes a great balance between a full-blown archer build and the more defensive approach of Totem's gameplay. Its insane movement speed coupled with phasing makes it a great delving build, allowing you to go very deep and reap greater rewards. These extra riches will come in handy as some of the best in slot items are obtained through corruptions, making them somewhat expensive. On the plus side, each upgrade will make a huge impact on your damage as Elemental Hit scales very well with gem levels and gear in general. Getting better equipment will always feel very rewarding rather than just a marginal improvement. The build shines more towards the middle of a league as some of the key items aren't really available in the first days, making it less suitable for a league starter. Once the economy settles and prices drop to their normal levels, you can really pimp out this build or even bankroll other characters. It can run pretty much every map mode except for Elemental Reflect and No Mana Regen. The first one will kill your totems quite fast, while the second prevents you from summoning them in the first place. You can power through these, but it's more time consuming. Now that you know what you're getting, roll up your sleeves and let's start building. The guide is divided into 7 main sections: Build Overview, Passive Tree and Leveling, Ascendancy, Pantheon, Gems and Links, Gear, Flasks and Jewels, and finally Pros and Cons. In the video description below you will find a link for importing the entire build guide in Path of Building tool. It includes a passive tree broken down into level brackets, example gear, and a detailed notes section with tips for gearing, stats priorities and gems. With that out of the way, it's time to lay out the build overview. The main tool of this build is the excellent Elemental Hit, one of the most interesting attack skills in the game. By default, on each attack it randomly chooses between fire, cold or lightning and deals damage with that respective element. At a first glance, using all elements might seem like a great idea, but in practice this would actually make you a jack of all trades and master of none. Otherwise put, it's far more efficient to focus on a single element and scale its damage rather than trying to do the same for all three at once. The way the passive tree and gear pieces are currently designed, mathematically speaking, you will always be better off using just one type of damage. Among the three, fire is the perfect choice for this build. In order to achieve this, you will have to use two uniques, the Crimson and Viridian Combat Focus Jewels. They prevent Elemental Hit from choosing cold or lightning, so it can only randomly pick fire from then on. The second part of this jewel's description might seem a bit strange. Why would Elemental Hit's cold or lightning damage be lower if it cannot even choose that element anymore? Well, this is actually a key component of the build's insane damage potential. While Elemental Hit cannot choose those two elements, this doesn't mean the damage itself is removed from the skill. For now, you can think about it as just sitting there unused. Then, the build uses damage conversion to get as much as possible from that untapped potential damage. This works because damage conversion happens before Elemental Hit chooses its element, so fire damage is greatly buffed before being picked. First tool you'll be using for this purpose is Avatar of Fire passive keystone, which converts 50% of physical, cold and lightning damage into fire damage. This is actually one of the main reasons why you're focusing on this element, as no other similar passives exist for cold or lightning. Then, by using Frostferno unique helmet, you convert the remaining 50% cold damage into fire as well. This only leaves half of the lightning damage not being converted. However, there aren't easy ways to transform all that into fire without sacrificing at least another gear slot, which could actually be used to get more damage and additional defenses. Another key aspect of Elemental Hit is that it works with both melee and range weapons, which enables the use of Chinsoul unique bow. Its close range damage bonus is an excellent multiplier for Elemental Hit's huge base, making it the top weapon for this build. It is also a very common item, so finding a good one should be really cheap. And the last piece of the puzzle, you'll be using totems instead of firing Elemental Hit arrows yourself. To better understand why, I first have to talk a bit about totems in general. A totem is a special kind of summoned ally, but which is not however considered a minion. There are several types of totems and they can be broadly split in two categories. Totems that have an innate ability which they're performing, such as Decoy Totem, and totem support gems which will instead use a skill that is linked with them. An example of this second category is Ranged Attack Totem Support, which we'll be using in this build. As the gem's description indicates, instead of using that skill, you will summon a totem that uses this skill for you. So if you link Elemental Hit with this ranged totem support, the totem itself will attack with this skill. I will of course go over this in greater detail in the gem section. It's also important to understand that skills used by totems are still affected by players' buffs, passives, auras, equipment and other linked support gems. For example, if you take a passive that says your projectiles pierce 2 additional targets, when elemental hit is used by a totem, its projectiles will also pierce 2 additional targets. Or if you use a flask that provides an attack speed buff, then elemental hit used by totems will also be faster. However, it's crucial to keep in mind that it is not the totem itself that gets higher attack speed, but only the skill. It's easier to understand this concept if you imagine totems as being some sort of automated clones of yourself that only fire the skill that you linked with range support totem. For this reason, stats such as life, resistances, regen, energy shield and so on will not have any impact on the totems, as these do not affect the skill in any way. So why would you use a totem instead of attacking yourself with elemental hit? The first reason is that through certain items, passives and Ascendancy, you can use 4 totems at once, each of them firing elemental hit projectiles. While totems natively have lower damage for balance purposes, with 4 of them out you still end up with much higher DPS than if you were to use the skill yourself. Then there's the defensive aspect. By summoning totems near enemies, you effectively create a wall between them and yourself. As such, monsters will be more interested in attacking totems rather than the player, allowing you to stay at a safer distance and not be forced to constantly hit and run. This leads us to the next advantage of using totems, positioning. When manually using a ranged skill, you fire a few arrows, relocate to a safer spot and then fire again, rinse and repeat. The problem with this playstyle is that it has a lot of damage application downtime. Otherwise, put every second you're moving around is a second you're not dealing damage. Totems, however, will shoot non-stop until either themselves or the enemies are dead. While indeed totems can be destroyed and they also have a limited duration, it is very easy to just resummon them immediately. In practice, you'll only do that in tough boss fights, as everything else dies too fast. As for defenses, the build is best suited for evasion. Through several passives using Grace Aura and blinding your enemies, you will see that around 70 to 80% effective chance to evade attacks. On top of that, you also add the dodge layer through acrobatics and phase acrobatics keystone passives. Finally, you are able to generate endurance charges really fast thanks to Conviction of Power passive from the Ascendancy, a great defensive tool for this build. Since totems cannot leech life for you and evading attacks is never 100% sure, you will need to adopt a more careful playstyle. Avoid charging in front too much and instead get used to place your totems far ahead as a sort of scouts. They'll start firing if there's any monster in range, and by the time you get there, the area should be clear. Having covered the build overview, it's time to start talking about the passive tree and leveling. You start off as a Templar, and the number one priority in the first few acts is to transition from attacking by yourself to using totems. Second important objective is to force elemental hit to only deal fire damage and convert cold and lightning to that as well. Elemental Hit gem is normally obtainable in Act 3, but you should generally be able to buy it for cheap from other players. Until then, use any ranged skill you like. Split arrow, shrapnel shot, burning arrow, either will work just fine. You can also add any support gems you can get your hands on until then. As a temporary weapon, use any rare bow that has some elemental damage on it, or if you can afford it, get the Quill Rain unique. With its huge attack speed, it will shred everything to pieces until you can use Chin Sol at level 62. In Act 1 you'll immediately get several significant passives which will serve as a great starting base. First you go for Sanctity and Discipline and Training for a whole bunch of life to ensure you survive the initial encounters. You then switch to damage passives by taking Retribution, Holy Dominion and Divine Fervor. Not only do they grant a large amount of DPS, but also a lot of attributes such as Int and Strength. Second act starts off with an even mix of offense and defense through Precision and Devotion significant passives. You then start heading south and take Constitution for a huge HP bonus. On the way, you should also grab the first Jewel socket of the build. If you're able to get your hands on the Crimson Combat Focus Jewel, socket it here as there are enough attributes in its radius to activate the bonuses. Otherwise, temporarily use any other Jewel you have available, but remember to replace it as soon as you get the proper Combat Focus one. This act also brings with it Deal with the Bandits quest, and for this build the best choice is to kill them all and get the 2 points. While some of the Bandits bonuses would be useful, there are so many amazing passives that can be easily snagged for 2 points that killing them is clearly a superior option. In Act 3 you should be able to finally buy Range Attack Totem Support Gem from the Ghost NPC in the library after completing his quest. Link the support gem with Elemental Hit, and from this point onward, whenever you use the skill, it will instead summon a totem which will cast it instead of you. After you have the support gem in place, take Ancestral Bond Keystone from the Totem Wheel to completely transition to a Totem's playstyle. The Keystone will allow you to summon an additional totem, but it also prevents you from dealing any direct damage yourself. You can still use skills as usual, but they won't deal any damage after you get this passive. Coming back to the tree, here's how it should look around Act 3. You finish off this act by also grabbing Sentinel Notable passive for some really handy resistances and evasion. You should also try to get a Skirmish Quiver as soon as possible. This grants an extra totem which practically boosts your current DPS by 50%. It has always been cheap and in abundance, so there's really no reason not to get one early on. Start Act 4 by taking a socket where you should put Rain of Splinters unique jewel. This will cause your totems to fire 2 additional projectiles, making them much more efficient at clearing large packs of mobs. You then continue by taking yet another socket for the Viridian Combat Focus Jewel, as there is enough dexterity in its radius for the bonuses to be activated. Once you have both Combat Focus Jewels in place, Elemental Hit will only pick fire as its attack element. After that, you should grab Avatar of Fire Keystone to convert part of the unused cold and lightning damage into fire. However, make sure you do not take this passive before having both jewels socketed, as it will just decrease your DPS. Start Acts 5 and 6 by investing in Primal Manifestation and Totemic Zeal wheels to greatly buff pretty much every aspect of your totems: damage, attack speed, life and duration. These passives also provide a bunch of totem placement speed, a stat which allows you to summon totems faster, making your gameplay much smoother. You then take Finesse Significant passive for a great damage boost through attack speed and accuracy, as well as Heart of Oak for a large amount of HP. While leveling through Acts 7 and 8, you will first take Herbalism for even more life and better Flask recovery. Then go for Piercing Shots, a passive which will improve your clearing speed significantly, as your totem's projectiles will now go through to enemies. Finish off with Acrobatics Keystone, which will grant you a flat 30% dodge chance, greatly increasing your survivability. In Acts 9 and 10, grab Phase Acrobatics for a similar 30% dodge chance, but this time for spells. Then get a massive damage boost through Berserking Wheel, Forces of Nature and Art of the Gladiator. This will provide large amounts of elemental damage and penetration, attack speed and accuracy, turning your totems into real machine guns. Finish off Act 10 by taking Revenge of the Hunted and Bravery for even more HP and evasion. All these passives should provide a nice mix of damage and defenses right as you're approaching the final boss. By level 80, you should take Primeval Force Cluster for a huge amount of elemental damage and increased chance to shock and ignite. Fury Bolts is also really close by, so drop 2 points there to get some much needed accuracy and projectile damage. As you work toward level 90, grab Purity of Flesh for some life and chaos resistance, and then get Lethality to significantly boost your critical strike chance and damage. This works very well with power charges that you are able to generate through your Ascendancy. Finally, grab another Jewel socket above Sentinel passive. From level 90 onward, there are several options depending on what you feel like you're missing most, damage or defenses. I recommend a more balanced approach by taking Ballistic Mastery, Aspect of the Eagle and Heartseeker, along with a bunch of life nodes near Constitution. Full damage and full defense options can also be found in a Path of Building guide material. And that's about it for the passive tree and leveling. In the next section, I'll be covering the Ascendancy class, which improves pretty much every single aspect of this build. For Totem's playstyle, there's practically only one Templar Ascendancy that provides useful tools, and that is the Hierophant. The first points go into Pursuit of Fate, which grants you an additional totem, bringing your total to 4 when using Skirmish Quiver. On top of that, it provides a stackable damage buff for each enemy killed by your totems in the past 4 seconds. This has no upper cap and you will consistently be able to get 40 or 50 stacks when killing bigger packs. After completing Cruel Labyrinth, spend the points on Ritual of Awakening, an excellent quality of life passive. With it, you will summon 2 totems instead of 1 with each cast. While this doesn't increase your maximum totems cap, it does make deploying all of them so much quicker and thus greatly boosting your clearing speed. You also get a whole bunch of life and mana regen along with some additional damage for each active totem. The third Ascendancy passive is Conviction of Power. It provides a high chance to generate power charges each time you summon a totem or a totem kills an enemy. In addition, there's also a chance to gain an endurance charge each time you get a power charge, so in practice you will end up with both being almost permanently present. It's a good idea to use this before engaging a harder boss by summoning totems until you have 3 charges of both types. Finally, after completing the last labyrinth, the points are pretty much useless. Unfortunately, none of the remaining major passives are worth anything for this build. Divine Guidance might seem decent at a first glance, but with 2 active auras, you'll have under 100 unreserved mana, so this mini Mind Over Matter passive is useless. Not only that, but any hit would leave you with 0 mana and unable to summon your totems to kill whatever was attacking you. I've tried playing with it for a few levels and ended up dying several times because of this, so I definitely recommend against using Divine Guidance. As such, get these 2 minor passives for some increased maximum mana and mana regen. With the Ascendancy out of the way, we can take a quick look at the Pantheon choices. Generally speaking, Pantheon choices are situational and there isn't a best pair that will outperform all others in any circumstances. However, there are certain options that complement specific builds quite well in a wide range of scenarios. For this particular case, here are my recommendations. For the Major God, Soul of Lunaris. Once you gather all its powers, it is a great defensive Pantheon which will further boost your chance to dodge and avoid attacks. For the Minor God, the optimal choice is Soul of Grafkul. It grants a significant amount of physical damage reduction while also decreasing the attack speed of any enemy that hits you. A good alternative Minor God is Soul of Shakari for poison immunity as well as some chaos resistance. Having covered the Pantheon choices, we can now focus on one of the most important aspects of any build, gems and links. As usual, I'll start off with the main skill, Elemental Hit and its support gems. For this build, you are not using a real 6-link item, but instead you will socket Elemental Hit into Frostferno unique helmet. This setup will end up being superior to any other 6-link combination. The first reason is the line saying socketed gems are supported by level 30 cold to fire. This will convert the remaining 50% cold damage to fire, reaching 100% conversion when paired with Avatar of Fire. On top of that, it also adds a whole bunch of extra fire damage, making it an insane DPS boost much better than any 5-link you could use. The other amazing benefit you get from Frostferno is plus 4 levels to Elemental Hit, since this gem is considered fire as well as cold. As I mentioned in the build overview, Elemental Hit scales incredibly well with each gem level, so having a level 24 one is way stronger than any other support gem you could use in a 6 socket. In the gearing section, I will also talk about pushing this even further by corrupting Frostferno helmet. Coming back to the gem setup, you have your Elemental Hit, which is then linked with Range Attack Totem. This gem is absolutely mandatory, so you can have totems firing the skill instead of you. Quality on this gem increases totem placement speed, which is always good for a smoother gameplay. Next support gem is Combustion, which provides a huge amount of fire damage as well as chance to ignite. On top of that, enemies that are ignited have lower fire resistance, further increasing Elemental Hit's effectiveness. The last support is Elemental Damage with Attacks, a straightforward elemental damage boosting gem with no downsides. Before getting Frostferno, you can have Elemental Hit socketed in any gear piece with more links. You can also use Greater Multiple Projectiles gem before having Rain of Splinters Jewel and Pierce support until you take Piercing Shots passive in the tree. Up next is a 5-link curse setup, an excellent way to boost both your offensive and defensive capabilities. This will be socketed in your bow, which will thus only need 5 links, making it much cheaper than the usual 6-link weapons required for other builds. However, you should still aim to have 6 sockets, as you will use the unlinked one for another skill gem. Coming back to curses, normally you are able to cast a single one, but by using Windshriek boots, you will increase this cap by 1. First is Flammability, a curse which drastically reduces enemies' fire resistance as well as increasing your chance to ignite them. Second one is Enfeeble, which is the best defensive curse for an evasion build. It decreases enemies' accuracy as well as critical strike chance and damage. As accuracy goes against your evasion rating, in effect it will help you avoid many more attacks than you would normally do. Then by reducing monsters' crit chance and damage, you'll be able to survive hits that get past evasion and dodge, preventing you from getting one shot. Since manually casting 2 different curses is time consuming, the third gem used in this setup is Curse on Hit. This trigger gem will automatically apply curses on all targets hit by any linked active skill. This active skill is Frenzy, and each target hit by it will receive both curses simultaneously due to its interaction with Curse on Hit. On top of that, Frenzy will also grant a Frenzy charge for each enemy it hits, boosting your attack speed and damage. While you cannot deal any damage directly because of Ancestral Bond, both Curse on Hit and Frenzy charges generation require you only to hit enemies, not necessarily to also damage them. Basically, you hit monsters for 0 damage and that's sufficient. Frenzy can be kept at level 1 as additional levels would only boost its damage, but you are not dealing any. Quality, however, increases its attack speed, and this is actually useful, so get some if you can. The last support gem for this setup is Greater Multiple Projectiles. Since curses cast with a trigger gem no longer have an area of effect but are instead applied on each individual monster, you want to hit as many of them as possible. The way you play with these skills is quite simple. You place your totems on the front line as close as possible to mobs, then spam Frenzy to curse everything it hits and generate Frenzy charges. However, you shouldn't bother too much with this curse setup while going through story mode. At lower levels, the top priority is having an efficient Elemental Hit. This means multiple totems firing multiple projectiles which pierce. Finally, if you have a 6 socket on your bow, use Blink Arrow. It's not necessary for this gem to be linked with the others as it has nothing to do with the curse setup. It is a mobility skill that can be used to bypass obstacles and get across ledges or elevated terrain. Next up are the auras. First is Val Haste, a skill that has 2 components. The regular haste aura, which provides its usual bonuses, and the Val part, which can be activated for a short but very strong movement and attack speed buff. The aura component is constantly active just as with any regular aura, while the Val one can be activated once you have gathered enough souls. These are obtained by killing normal monsters or when damaging bosses. The second aura is Val Grace. Similar to Val Haste, it also has 2 components. The regular aura, which provides a large amount of evasion, and the Val part, which will greatly increase your dodge chance for a few seconds. This is a great panic button that will save your life in many fights. In order to be able to keep both auras active, you will need to link them with Enlightened support gem of at least level 2. This will reduce the amount of reserve mana and will leave you with just enough to be able to summon totems or use Frenzy. However, I strongly recommend getting at least a level 3 one, otherwise you will often find yourself with 0 mana. The last support gem in this setup is Increased Duration. While it doesn't affect the auras in any way, it will however almost double the duration of the Val buffs, making them much more useful especially in boss fights. The build also uses a defensive cast when damage taken setup. This will trigger other active gems which are linked with it when you take a certain amount of damage. Since this damage threshold increases with gems level, you don't want to max it out as it would then become almost useless. Waiting to receive over 3000 damage to trigger it is not exactly a great tactic. Based on the potential HP pool for this build, you should keep it at level 8. The triggered gem is Immortal Call. It will grant you physical damage immunity for a short time frame, which is then further increased if it consumes endurance charges. Since you generate them easily, you should obtain the full duration buff quite often. However, you need to remember that a low cost when damage taken gem also means that the triggered gems have to be lower as well. As consequence, Immortal Call should be kept at level 10. You then add increased duration support gem, so Immortal Call gets to last even longer. Last gem for this setup is Phase Run, your main movement skill. It provides a significant movement speed bonus as well as phasing buff, allowing you to pass through enemies. This is a great defensive mechanism as you can sometimes end up surrounded, which is the last thing you want as an evasion character. Keep in mind that using any other skill will interrupt this effect, so try to get to safety first. Level it all the way to 20 so it is not triggered by cost when damage taken. You want to be able to use it manually when moving around, not randomly when getting hit. However, you should still have it linked in this setup so it benefits from increased duration support. To wrap up this section, here's a compact list of gems you should aim to have at 20% quality. It is also a good idea to try and get a level 21 elemental hit through corruption. As I was saying in the build overview, the skill scales incredibly well with gem levels, so it is well worth the effort and investment. Similarly for combustion, while the damage increase is not as large, it's still significant enough to be worth it. Gearing up for this build isn't actually too difficult as most necessary unique items are cheap and available even from the first days of a new league. While certain corrupted versions of these uniques might be quite expensive, on the flip side the build doesn't require a 6-link item. All in all, even with some of the best corrupted items, you will end up with a gearing cost similar to other builds. Starting with the helmet, as mentioned earlier in the guide, you'll be using Frostferno unique. Call to Fire support affix converts all remaining cold damage into fire, as well as granting a large amount of additional fire damage on top. The +2 levels to socketed fire gems affix affects both elemental hit and combustion, pushing each to level 22. Then the +2 levels to cold gems affix further levels up elemental hit to 24, greatly increasing its base damage. This works because elemental hit is considered both a fire and cold gem. While Frostferno is generally not too expensive, you can also obtain it yourself through a Vision of Ice and Fire prophecy. You complete this by killing the boss in Estuary map while having Heat Shiver helmet in your inventory or equipped. This is one of the most common and cheap unique items in the game, so it should be really easy to get one. The prophecy itself can also be bought from other players or randomly given by Navali. When the prophecy is fulfilled, Heat Shiver will be upgraded into Frostferno, maintaining the original links and sockets. Frostferno can also have some amazing corruptions for this build, providing an additional bonus of +2 levels to socketed gems. The absolute best one is +2 levels to fire gems, boosting both elemental hit and combustion, but there are other good ones as well, which are generally much cheaper. Here's a list of possible corruptions ordered from highest DPS to lowest. For the weapon slot, you should go with Chin Sol Unique Bow. It provides a huge damage boost against enemies shot at close range. This is completely inherited by your totems as long as you place them as close as possible to monsters. Look for one with maximum attack speed roll. The physical damage affix is not that important as you get very little benefit from it. Since you only need 5 links, it should be relatively cheap to buy or to craft it yourself. In the offhand, you'll use Skirmish Quiver, which allows you to summon an additional totem. These are really cheap and no other alternative would come even close to the amount of damage it provides. When you can afford it, you should try to buy a corrupted one with point blank, and this will even further increase the close range damage of your totems. The base generally costs around 1 chaos, so it's not at all expensive to obtain the corruption yourself. For the body armor, the absolute best in slot is Kaum's Heart, providing a huge amount of HP and some fire damage. One of the most important defensive goals for an evasion-based character is to have a large enough health pool to survive huge hits that would normally one-shot you. With high enough dodge and evading chance, you rarely get struck by large hits, but when that happens, you must have enough life to survive. Kaum's Heart helps you achieve exactly that, and it can push your HP over the 6000 mark. If Kaum is too expensive, then you can temporarily use a Belly of the Beast. Since you don't need it to be linked, you'll surely find one for really cheap. You are losing quite a bit of life and damage when compared to Kaum's Heart, but it's a good budget option. For gloves, you should get a pair of rare ones with some attack speed, added flat fire damage to attacks, life and resistances. For a higher budget, get all these affixes on a gripped gloves base, which comes with an implicit bonus to projectiles damage. As hinted in gem section, the build uses Windshriek boots for additional curse. On top of that, they provide a decent amount of resistances and movement speed, as well as some elemental damage, an affix which is not usually found on this gear slot. Moving on to the belt, a low budget one should have at least 70 plus life, resistances and some form of fire damage. This can be either explicit as increased fire damage or a combination of elemental damage and elemental damage with attacks. All these affixes are equivalent with each other, so 10% increased fire damage will provide the same DPS as 10% increased elemental damage. Best in slot is the Stygian Vice Belt with a total bonus to fire damage of at least 60% as well as life and resistances. The socket will allow you to use an Abyss Jewel, which will provide significant bonuses for this build. A lower budget amulet can be a rare one with a combination of increased fire damage, life and some resistances. Other useful affixes are critical strike multiplier, 200 plus accuracy or added flat fire damage to attacks. A slightly more expensive amulet but still affordable is Yoke of Suffering, a great addition to this build. When wearing this, all your elemental damage will be able to shock. Normally only lightning damage would be able to do that, but with Yoke of Suffering, fire damage can shock as well. Shocked enemies take a lot more damage from any source and this alone will increase your DPS by a huge amount. Your rings should be a pair of rare ones with similar affixes as a rare amulet, a combination of increased fire damage, life and enough resistances to have all of them capped. Other useful affixes are critical strike multiplier, 200 plus accuracy or added flat fire damage to attacks. Up next are jewels, a very important component of this build. As I've mentioned in the build overview section, you will need 2 combat focused jewels to force Elemental Hit to only pick fire element. These are the Crimson and Viridian versions of the jewel, or easier to remember, red and green ones. There is also a blue version of combat focus, but that one blocks fire damage, so do not use it unless you want to ruin the entire build. The other mandatory jewel is Rain of Splinters. With it, your totems will fire 2 additional projectiles, greatly increasing your clear speed. Without it, the build will feel really awkward, so get one as soon as possible. This leaves at least one additional socket in the passive tree, and the best option is a Watcher's Eye jewel. Ideally, you should get one that provides extra dodge and evasion chance while affected by haste and grace respectively. These are flat bonuses that get added on top of your existing chance to evade or dodge, so they are incredibly powerful when compared to what any other jewel would provide. If you're using a Stygian Vice belt, then you'll also have a free socket for an Abyss jewel, and a Searching Eye is likely your best bet. Since you will only have one of these, you should get as much utility from it as possible. I strongly recommend to get at least chance to blind enemies on hit, and damage penetrates elemental resistance if you haven't killed recently. The first will greatly reduce enemies' chance to hit and implicitly increase your chance to evade. Your totems will of course inherit this ability, so their hits will do most of the blinding, but Frenzy works as well. The second one is a significant and at the same time permanent damage buff, since you never actually kill anything. It's your totems that do all the killing. This applies to any other similar affixes on other pieces of gear. If it says if you haven't killed recently, then it is in fact a permanent buff for this build. Other good affixes on the Abyss jewel are flat life, increased accuracy if you haven't killed recently, or fire damage to bow attacks. With the regular gear out of the way, it is time to talk about everyone's favorite, the Flasks. First is a Seeding Divine Life Flask of Staunching. Instant life recovery is great for an evasion build, and bleeding remover is absolutely mandatory in the later stages of the game. Then go for a classic Wise Oak, an excellent 2-in-1 defensive and offensive flask. Just make sure that fire resistance has the highest uncapped value of all, so the damage bonus applies to fire damage. Third one should be a Chemist Silver Flask for the attack speed buff with a hit suffix for freeze immunity. Make sure to roll a high enough prefix so it consumes only 30 charges, thus allowing you to use it twice. Fourth slot is taken by an experimental Quartz Flask. This provides 10% chance to dodge both attacks and spells, as well as phasing buff allowing you to pass through enemies. The suffix should be of warding for curse immunity, a must have when mapping. Last one is up to personal preference. You can go for example with a Quicksilver Flask of Adrenaline for a massive movement speed buff. Alternatively, you can use a Dying Sun Unique Flask for 2 extra projectiles, greatly increasing your totem's coverage and clear speed. Based on their overall impact on the build, level requirement, price and general availability, this is the recommended gearing order. Of course, this is not an absolutely strict order and you can shuffle these around a bit, but following it will generally provide the smoothest upgrade progression. To wrap up gearing section, here are a few excellent leveling uniques that will help you easily advance through story mode. With gearing out of the way, it is time to take a final look at the pros and cons of the build so you can better understand if it's what you are looking for. Starting over the pros, incredible clearing speed. Your totems are practically machine guns tearing everything to shreds. Most of the time you won't get to place more than 2 totems before everything on screen is dead. A great boss killer, not only does it have huge DPS, but with totems doing most of the work you are free to move around and avoid all the nasty stuff thrown at you. Excellent real damage application. Moving around or repositioning will not cause any damage downtime as the totems will continue firing away. Amazing mobility between high base movement speed, phase run, blink arrow and flasks. This is one of the quickest and most agile builds out there. This makes it especially efficient for mapping and delving. Really easy playstyle, you place your totems on the front line while you sit back at a safe distance and maybe spam frenzy. Then blink to pick up loot and move to the next pack. No 6 link item required, making it easier to get all the necessary gems online. As for the cons, totem playstyle, this involves a slight delay until your damage comes online, as you first have to actually place the totems instead of shooting directly. Damage wise, this is quickly offset by the number of totems, but it might seem a bit awkward for some players. It is an evasion build. While you will end up with a very beefy chance to dodge and evade attacks, there will always be some hits that will pass through. When that happens, they will hurt quite a bit as you don't have great damage reduction mechanisms. And while evasion in Path of Exile isn't completely random, it is entirely possible to get a few consecutive hits that will kill you. Unlikely, but still possible. Base and slow corrupted items are not cheap and generally not available during the first days of a new league, so optimizing gear might be a bit trickier. You can of course get by with the basic uncorrupted pieces, but squeezing everything out of the build requires some investment. The build cannot easily run two map modes, Elemental Reflect and no mana regen. You can still circumvent both issues by simply resummoning totems each time they die to reflect and using mana flasks.
Learn anything new, Exile?
If you did, then you'll probably be happy to hear that there are more videos coming up in the near future with more exciting builds to try. Make sure not to miss them by subscribing to the channel so you get notified when that happens. And while you're at it, why not like this video as well or drop a comment down below to let me know your thoughts. Thank you all for watching and see you next time.